Well, welcome to another episode of Open World Chat. I am one of your hosts, John Odom, and I'm here with the other host, Jim Dandeneau. And we're going to have fun today. We have as a guest Dr. Mark Card. And let me see if I can get through all your credentials here, Mark. You've got a master's and a PhD from Texas A&M, specializing in international conflict. You were a Fulbright Scholar to the Graduate Institute of International Studies at the University of Geneva, and you're an alum of the Stanford University and Hoover Institute on International Conflict. Sorry, I just doubled up institute there, but you know, it still counts. And you're joining us today to deconstruct and play around with that Star Trek Holy of Holies, the Prime Directive. I'm very excited and welcome, and thank you for being here.
Oh, you're quite welcome. This will be fun.
Well, first of all, why don't I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. We could go all over the place. We could go for a couple hours on this, although probably folks would start falling asleep. But I'll just start it for those listening who don't know, and there are none who don't know who are listening. But the Prime Directive is General Order 1. And I did a little looking, and the closest we got to actually laying it out in verbatim was from the original series episode, Bread and Circuses, where we are told it's no identification of self or mission, no interference with the social development of said planet, no references to space, other worlds, or advanced civilizations. So this is the big rule that says that the Starfleet cannot interfere with other cultures.
With pre-warp cultures.
Oh, well, pre-warp cultures, but the big question is whether they're developing cultures, and even pre-warp cultures is a question we might want to get into today, because there's incredible inconsistencies on this. So Mark, give us the rundown. How does this look as foreign policy? Something good?
It's interesting because it's an international norm. And in this particular case, it would be an interfederation norm. Keep in mind that one of the problems with stuff like this is that you end up with the principle is only as good as the members of the organization are willing to follow it. So one of the problems that the Federation is going to have is that, well, the Romulans don't have this Prime Directive. The Klingons don't have this Prime Directive. The Cardassians don't. The Ferengi certainly don't. So how useful is it when everybody else around you is not participating in it? And so that becomes the real problem, like any other international norm. You know, we have international laws, but almost everybody violates them at one point or another. And sometimes they have good, valid, justifiable reasons for it, and sometimes it's just about raw, naked power. So the Prime Directive becomes one of those things that, while you know you want to try to adhere to it as much as possible, you just may not be able to. Mm-hmm. And there might be times when it's just not valuable or practical, or following it may cause an existential crisis.
Well, is it a question of usefulness, though, if it's a statement of an ethic? If it's, because you think of statements of morality, well, I don't steal, and it doesn't matter if people I encounter might steal. That's an ethical principle, and I'm going to stick to it.
Sure, as long as you actually do stick to it. But in Star Trek, it's everywhere. There are gazillions of episodes where they don't stick to it at all. Mm-hmm. And it's not mentioned, and it's not even discussed. It's kind of interesting. I was looking at the first, the original series episodes, and there are kind of some highlights in there. And from the get-go, even though they don't mention the Prime Directive, the unaired pilot, the Cage, and then the Menagerie later on, you know, when they decided to incorporate that into the regular season, that right there shows why it's so important to have the Prime Directive. Look at how the Telosians interfered in the Federation's business. And, you know, what's the penalty from then on for approaching Talos?
Ooh, death.
That's right. It's one of the few death sentences left in this super progressive culture.
Yeah, the only one, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. And the whole point, I mean, that just demonstrates to you why you have to have this kind of intergalactic ethic. But as I said, what happens if you don't follow it? So you've got an ethic, but as we all know, ethics can sometimes end up being relational. But yeah, so if you look at the cage / the menagerie, this shows the necessity for the Prime Directive. It shows that you can have disastrous effects on everyone around you, even to the point of threatening your own species, if you intervene in other cultures which aren't as advanced. I mean, obviously, the Delusion culture is completely, totally, it's a quantum leap away from the Federation. I mean, they can control everything with illusions.
Well, there's also is it the Voyager episode where the Ferengi get stranded in the Delta Quadrant and they become gods to the pre-warp civilization? Am I remembering this right?
I think you're remembering it right.
I obviously didn't have time to rewatch all of Star Trek ever.
I remember about every other Voyager.
Yeah, that's about where I'm at with Voyager too. But that's your, like, you got the Telosians on kind of the Federation end of the spectrum, but then you've got also, the downward looking perspective, which is, what is it? It's Arthur C. Clarke's rule, right? Any sufficiently advanced civilization, their technology will appear as magic to us.
Yeah.
Right. So, you've got the Ferengi with their replicators and their weather control machines that are using it to accumulate gross personal wealth on a pre-warp planet. And it is appalling the way that they're exploiting these people. And that's another one of the Federation's, I guess, exhortations in favor of the Prime Directive.
Yeah, I mean, in general, as a rule, it's a great idea. You don't want to expose civilizations that aren't as far advanced on the spectrum to stuff that's essentially magic. I mean, you can completely disrupt whatever development they might have.
Right.
As we see in every season of every show, there are instances where the writers violate it.
Right.
Well, it's a product of its time too. I mean, it's clearly anti-colonial, which is nice. But obviously Vietnam was going on then, and we were like, a lot of folks were like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It does come from the Vietnam culture and support of the protest movement against Vietnam. But what's funny is it's not very long into season 1 before they break it. The episode Taste of Armageddon. The one where the
I love
planets, I love that episode too, where the two planets have decided that they're going to institutionalize and sanitize war. And instead of actually fighting each other, they run an algorithm which spits out casualty lists. And then they all have to report to death machines, and they voluntarily step in, and as a duty to their planet and the idea of institutionalized, sanitized war, they step right in. And what does Kirk do with that disruptor pistol? He starts destroying the booths because no society should sanitize war. So we're already, I don't know how many episodes that is in, a step back as far as we can go from the... Now, having said that, I don't think they really discuss whether or not it's a pre-warp culture. But it seems like it's a violation of the Prime Directive.
They put a cheat in it too. I mean, later on, this is all still original series, and I'd love to get to more as well. I'm sure we will. But what episode is it? I think it's the Apple, where you've got this population sort of held in developmental and cultural stasis, in which I think that's the one where Kirk says, well, that only applies to healthy developing cultures. So there's a big out for you.
Yeah, that's definitely a big out. But again, as I said, this is the problem with international norms. This is the problem with intergalactic norms, is that while they may be kind of hailed as a standard, when it comes down to it, what becomes the most important dynamic? And that's power.
Oh, that's depressing.
Well, sure it is. But, even the Federation has let's face it, this is a TV show. And the writers are going to be looking for some way to develop some action in the show. And to do that, you might want to examine what happens if you violate the Prime Directive.
Which they did also. They beat some people up for doing it. But yeah, it's all right for, Kirk to, and not anybody else. I don't know. Maybe that's just a good axiom in general. It's all right if Kirk does it.
Isn't that I'm not through Lower Decks yet either, but isn't that the premise of like half of the early Lower Decks episodes? Is that it's not just Kirk who does this?
Yeah. They have a lot of fun with it.
Right.
Which is a great place. I mean, it hasn't really come up in recent years except as a gag. I mean, there's that, but also when they had it in the J.J. Abrams reboots there, that beginning scene in Into Darkness where they're, running to get away from the aliens. You see at the end of the teaser there, they've drawn a big picture of the Enterprise that they're all worshiping. I mean, that's a variation on the gangster planet in the first, which is also played for laughs, but it doesn't seem like they're taking it too seriously these days.
Well, and sometimes, and I'm going back to the original series a lot because, that's kind of sets the tone for the Prime Directive, both as a writing device and as a general idea behind the civilization developed by the Federation. But, McCoy screws up, shoots himself full of quarterzine, jumps into the gateway on the city of Edge of Forever. And now they're forced to violate the Prime Directive. But that's to keep their own civilization back on track.
Does that count as violating the Prime Directive?
It's your own civilization.
It's a pre-warp culture.
Fair. That's fair.
Oh,
so, Mark, are there any international norms that you know of that are kind of analogs to this? Are there any, in the real world?
Geneva Convention.
Yeah.
I think the Geneva Convention is a good one. Law of the Sea is a good one.
Okay.
There are certain.
What's the Law of the Sea?
The Law of the Sea says that a certain extent, a certain distance out from your coastline is considered your territory and inviolable. We're seeing some pushback on that now in the South China Sea with China building artificial islands to kind of push that outward. But most countries will abide by the international law of the sea. There are salvage rights. Maritime salvage rights are a very good example of an international norm that actually works. And the way that, that's kind of a ultimate Ferengi law. And the first people to show up at a maritime wreck, they get to claim everything they can salvage. There are some fishing rights that are a good example of norms in that you have, as a country, a right to fishing in certain zones, although we've actually gone to war in the 20th century over that. Iceland and England had a short little war involving fishing rights. A lot of that may end up being more intensified with global warming.
Yeah, well, and the English do love shooting at people over their fish.
That's probably a fair statement. Trying to think if there's anything else that comes to mind. Alliances, generally speaking, have worked out well as international norms. Even in the Cold War, you have NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And those,
sure,
that's a great example because the Warsaw Pact was fairly coercive. But there are a few which work pretty well. Most countries do try and stick to the Geneva Convention during warfare. But then again, what happens when you start losing? Right.
And I'm thinking about enforcement too, particularly in light of kind of what's happening in Ukraine now. If there is no enforcement mechanism, which we see kind of in Star Trek, there isn't really an enforcement mechanism to the Prime Directive. Nobody ever gets punished for violations, right?
Yeah, no one's ever been punished for it as far as I'm aware.
So, without any kind of enforcement mechanism, there isn't anything besides their own moral integrity / the volume of angst the writers want to put in the episode holding anybody back from Prime Directive violations.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, like I said, it's a norm rather than an actual law.
Yeah.
that makes a difference. How would you enforce the Prime Directive?
Well, there's a military structure in the Federation. They could
that's
feasibly
true.
enforce it through court martials and stuff.
Well, and then the whole thing gets completely clouded when you look at Section 31. Who knows what they're doing?
Right. They don't even know what they're doing. Right. Like they're either being taken over by rogue AI in Discovery, or they're, blackmailing illegal genetic experiments in Deep Space Nine.
Or they're carrying out the temporal Cold War.
Exactly. Right.
In Enterprise.
So they're not an enforcement mechanism. They are Prime violators themselves.
Right. And they're without any kind of, there's no sanction on them for whatever they do.
God, they really break the show.
Yeah, they really
do. They're really like, I've liked individual episodes with them, but I really don't like what they do to Star Trek.
Yeah, see, I thought the same thing, in that they completely undermine the civilization that you are supposed to have developed, where material goods, material needs are fulfilled, and we don't interfere in other cultures. And now you've got Section 31 who can do whatever the hell they want, as long as we are perceived to be under threat.
Yeah. It's such a cynical, it's consistent with a realist take on the Star Trek utopia, because I think all of us living in the world that we do now expect that there is some group that has to have little to no restrictions on it to uphold some kind of nebulous sense of Federation ideals, right? That the crew of the Enterprise, that the crew of the Discovery, that the crew of Deep Space Nine or Voyager can live those ideals to their fullest, because there is a group willing to assassinate the right Klingon at the right time to keep things that way. Or that there is a group willing to poison the changeling homeworld, right?
But in the Star Trek ethic, though, you don't need to have that group. There is a bit of an honor system to enforce this stuff, because everybody's honorable. And when there's an exception, it's like Captain Tracy. It's shocking. It's horrifying.
Right.
And
but what Section 31. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that was part of the utopian ideal. That utopian ideal got a little out of control in the first season or two of Next Generation, where Roddenberry didn't even want people arguing with each other, really, and so that it got a little like, really. But still, I think at its root, there's supposed to be honor there. We're supposed to have it, and this implies that there isn't.
Well, it's the whole idea that Churchill said when he said that truth is protected by a bodyguard of lies. So that in order to have this system, in order to have a system which can operate and push this kind of ethic, which essentially what the point is to push this ethic on all of the members of the galaxy. That's the whole point of the Prime Directive. Oh, well, we're going to do things differently. And implied in that is you should too. But the idea is that if you're going to have a democracy, you have to have people who are willing to violate the principles of that democracy. So it ends up being a paradox. Can you have that democracy and protect that democracy if you don't have people who are willing to violate the idea of democracy? But I don't know. I think Section
maybe
30...
we can't.
Go ahead.
Well, I was saying, maybe we can't.
Y'all are depressing me more.
Yeah. Oh, no shit. It's fine. It's fine. The world is all peaches and sunshine, Don. Don't worry about it. Don't sweat it.
Or at least the 23rd century is supposed to be, damn it.
Well, that's where I'm coming back to, is right. Like we've got our utopian fiction that says that the world is this, or that the world can be this. Then that like basically you get 3 seasons of the original series and you get 5 seasons of the Next Generation before it intentionally undermines itself, right? Because it's like season 2 of Deep Space Nine when Section 31 comes in. Mm-hmm. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right, I think.
Yeah. So you basically get like 7 seasons worth of story before you get a retcon that completely undermines the utopian aspect of the show. And I say this as a Deep Space Nine partisan too. So I don't know. I don't really know where I'm going. with this other than just kind of being sad?
Well, I don't know.
Shit's a bummer, man.
It's true. And in Voyager, I mean, around the same time, they were explicit. Future Janeway comes back and tells Janeway basically, screw the Prime Directive. I mean, not in so many words, but
well, like I said, that Prime Directive is going to fall to practical, especially existential crisis situation.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
You destroy the transwarp hub and put the virus into the Borg, because if you don't, there is going to be no Federation.
Yeah.
Is any kind of conflict then with anybody else, strictly speaking, a violation of the Prime Directive?
Well, I don't know. I mean, is any kind of conflict a violation of that? That brings to mind the episode Private Little War.
Oh, yeah. Where Roddenberry threw up his hands and said, I don't know how to deal with this. Oh, well.
Yeah. Where, the situation where you've got two warring sides and the Klingons have already intervened in this civil war. And the question becomes, what happens to the other side if we don't intervene? Which is interesting to me, because that's kind of a justification for Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, the white unicorn apes might get them all, as I recall.
Well, no, there were two sides. The Klingons were pushing for one faction within that tribe to take over the other one. So it was a civil war, and he's like, well, we can rifle the barrels for them, and that won't be enough of a technological edge to completely wipe out the other side. It'll just give them a slight advantage because they've been behind for so long. And so, there's this tension between when do we follow the Prime Directive and when do we not follow the Prime Directive? And there are some good reasons for using the Prime Directive. I think the Taste of Armageddon is a good one of those that I mentioned earlier, where you've completely sanitized war, so that war is no more difficult than voting. Walk into a vote, get vaporized.
That one was always something I would cite, and I guess it uncovers my own frustrations with the Prime Directive. I always would compare that one to the Next Generation episode, Half a Life, with what's his name? All I want to say is Charles Emerson Winchester, David Ogden Stiers. Right. Where you got the guy who's his culture says, when you get to a certain age, you got to kill yourself. And Picard is like, yeah, well, what can I do? Prime Directive. Tough. Too bad for you. Maybe someday you all will be more enlightened. Goodbye. And I used to get so mad at that one. I would be like, damn it. If this were Kirk, he'd just take one phaser, take over the whole planet, and tell him to shape up. And,
But a lot of this, I mean, if you look at the international system on planet Earth, a lot of this is kind of dealt with. When do you intervene in a civil war and when do you not?
Or not dealt with.
I mean, look at Ukraine.
Right. Well, is it international norms that are dictating our non-involvement in Ukraine, or is it brutal realpolitik there? Right. Because we have very good reason to believe that if more people besides Russia and Ukraine are involved there, this thing could spiral out of control and engulf everybody. And there are some people who are making the argument that it already has.
Well, I would argue that we are involved.
Yeah.
Not directly involved, but we're definitely in a proxy war now.
Sure. But a lot of people would argue that we've been in a proxy war since 2014, right?
Yeah.
Because because there have been various cyber attacks on our interests and funding of certain, Syria and shit over there.
If you look at Ukraine, Russia really, to put it in Star Trek terms, got a whole lot of people who are committed to the Prime Directive change their minds.
Yeah.
I mean, Sweden been neutral for 200 years?
Yep.
And they're supplying arms to Ukraine.
Yep.
Finland with a 1,900-mile border. I don't know if that's accurate, but a giant border with Russia.
Yep.
They're getting involved.
They're joining NATO.
Yeah.
They're fast-tracking their NATO application as of yesterday.
And, I lived in Switzerland for a year, and so I can tell you right now that the one thing the Swiss love more than their money is their neutrality.
Yeah. And even the Nazi bankers are like, this is messed up, dudes.
Yeah. And if Switzerland has chosen now to violate their principle of neutrality, then, yeah, there's there are some good instances, and I'm not necessarily saying this is true in Ukraine, but that's an example of where, even though you have an international ethic, you might find a good reason to violate.
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at the whole premise of First Contact. The whole premise of First Contact is you have to, I guess that doesn't work because we're talking about they don't make first contact until we do have our first warp engine come online. So
they're still interfering. It's just, in a sense, more like a private little war that we were talking about, where the bad guys show up and interfere. So then we have to interfere to.
Yeah, because if we don't, there may be an existential crisis. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this tension between when do we violate it and when do we not. And some of that comes from the writers, but some of that also springs from the entire concept of this international / intergalactic ethic.
We're talking a lot about how it, or when it doesn't work. When does it work?
Well, I'll tell you one place where it works, but it's not the Federation violating it. And that's in the first season episode, Errand of Mercy, where the Organians see the squabble between the Klingons and the Federation on the mining planet.
Oh, and they say they think it's disgusting to get involved, right?
Yes. They say it's disgusting to get involved, but they force the Klingons and the Federation into an agreement which essentially prevents them from being involved in an existential crisis.
I have my own answer to this, but I'd love to hear both of you two guys' senses of what was the most egregious violation of the Prime Directive, in your opinion, that we were supposed to cheer on.
That's a good question. For me, it's got to be Janeway's decision to put the virus in the Borg and destroy the transwarp hub. It's the only way they're going to get back. And it's the only way they're going to prevent the Borg from assimilating the whole Federation.
But is that really a violation of the Prime Directive? Because, I mean, do they admit, I need to go back and rewatch Voyager. I've only caught bits and pieces of it as my wife rewatches it for the 8th time. But, that's not, I mean, I guess technically, at a very high level, they are interfering with the development of a species, right? Are the Borg even really a species?
Are they even really developing?
Right. They're not developing. They're pilfering. They're assimilating. They're consuming.
Well, hang on. Nobody says it. I mean, civilizations develop by international conflict all the time.
Right. By annexing territory. Yeah.
When you become the hegemon, I mean, as distasteful as it is, war is a useful tool in certain instances.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. That is not inaccurate.
And they do develop because they are assimilating technologies and characteristics they don't have.
Yeah. I don't know.
Having said that,
okay, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
The Borg don't interfere if the technology is not superior.
I thought they just consumed. I thought that they just swept across the galaxy and assimilated anyone that had bodies that they could add to the collective.
I think they go for the bodies too. I mean, I guess it's hard to say for sure.
In the opening statement they make, we are the Borg. Your technological distinctiveness will be assimilated.
Yeah,
that's true.
So I don't think they're just looking for, and you find out in all the series, except the original series, of course, that they ignore cultures which don't have sufficient technological development.
Okay.
So in a twist, you might say that the Borg are using a form of the Prime Directive.
And more faithful to it than anybody else in the universe.
Ooh, we're getting deep here.
That's a big statement right there, buddy.
My favorite violations of the Prime Directive are generally going to be when Riker needs to have sex with someone. Whenever Will Riker wants to have sex with a primitive civilization, and he just goes for it because that's who he is.
Well, yeah, but that's Kirk too.
Right. That's fair. But Kirk sits in chairs like a normal person, so he's one step below Riker for me.
Well, I think, and I don't remember exactly how it went down. Boy, I need to rewatch Deep Space Nine. But when,
you do, it's so good.
I know the one you're talking about.
Cisco and Garrick tricked the Romulans into getting involved in the war.
Oh shit! It's not Dance with the Devil in a Pale Moonlight. Hang on, I'm gonna find it. I know
That's an
exactly what it
outstanding
is.
episode
It is
because-
in the pale moonlight. In the pale moonlight.
But again, the question becomes: is that really a violation of the Prime Directive? Because they're a warped civilization.
Yep.
Yeah.
They are. And actually, pretty soon they're going to be super dependent on the Federation.
Yes, absolutely.
Actually, you know what? The holodeck, knowing what we know about all of the sentient life that's created by the holodeck, doesn't the existence of the holodeck / holosuites constitute an ongoing massive violation of the Prime Directive?
Only in the instances where you actually have sentient holodeck life. You know, it's not like it's actually spread throughout all the holodecks, right?
Well, I mean, I feel like it happens enough where you can assume 15% of the time your holodeck program is going to become a living life form, a living hard life form, right? Like Vic Fontana, Moriarty.
Right.
There's the lady that Geordi had sex with, who was actually real. What's his name? Geordi.
Yeah.
When Geordi was just being a nice guy.
The warp drive scientist.
Yeah, the warp drive lady. Yep.
Yeah.
She her holodeck person became sentient there, right?
Did that one become sentient too? That sound. Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's right.
There's the alien species that beamed their consciousness into the holodeck to talk to Riker so he could have sex with her at the jazz club.
We're missing the big example. The big example is, and it shows it, is the Doctor in Voyager.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
That's the big example. I mean, that's one of the first things he says is, hey, this is my life.
Yeah.
Why won't you let me do more things?
Right. And now Janeway and now the emergency command hologram in Prodigy, which is Janeway.
Yeah, but I would argue that those are entities in our culture. They're just different forms of life that are, it's different when you're talking about Moriarty, where he exists in this, completely different cultural context. It's just artificially created. But the Doctor, he's a doctor in our world. He's just essentially a different life form.
He was created to be the Doctor. Like there is actually a distinction. I agree. I think there is a distinction between Vic Fontaine and the Doctor. But I think my point stands though that that holosuite programs have become self-aware frequently enough where I think you can classify them as their own sub life form, and continued use of the holodeck or holosuites may constitute a holodeck.
Wait, there's an episode. There's a Voyager episode. Wait a minute. Oh, what am I thinking? There's a Voyager episode with all the holograms. Oh, crud. Am I making this up? Better look this up. I'll cut all this out. Oh,
I'm looking it up right now.
Okay.
All right.
I'm going to throw some cold water on your idea. If they are sentient, they're part of a warp culture.
Well, that's true. It's that warp culture thing again, but they're so inconsistent.
Yeah.
They've been inconsistent.
Well, see, I think
Charles Emerson Winchester,
later.
warp culture.
I think that was added later, because you could certainly argue that they're developing socially.
Yeah,
the holograms are.
They do.
So is the temporal Prime Directive anything different, or is that just a cool use of the term Prime Directive?
Well, I mean, if it is, then it's violated probably more than any other intergalactic norm there is. I mean, everybody violates the temporal Prime Directive.
Yeah.
The only person who objected to it was Archer. He's like, hey, should we be doing this?
Oh, Jesus. There's a whole section on Memory Alpha that's just about violations of the temporal Prime Directive.
I mean, they're huge. They're everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to go back to the one with Terry Garr and what's his face? I can't remember his name. Gary Lockwood.
Yes.
That was with Gary Lockwood? You don't mean the Gary 7 one, do you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he's from the same time though. They're just from a far away.
No, but no, they go back. They're accidentally shot back.
Oh, I thought you meant Gary 7's people, the Watchers.
No.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, they're accidentally shot back in time, and they have to make sure that the astronaut who's the first manned mission to Saturn actually gets there.
Oh, you're mixing episodes. I got you.
Okay, you're right. Wait, doesn't Gary 7 appear twice?
Nope.
This is, by the way,
the same one with Terry Garr.
No, Terry Garr is the Gary 7 one, which is a pilot for another show spinoff that never happened. And then you're thinking of Tomorrow is Yesterday, where they accidentally hit like a black hole. They call it a black star. They're flung back in time, and there's the astronaut with the, and they have to go around.
You're right. Yeah, I'm mixing up two different episodes. You're right.
Gary 7, they went back on purpose to study. Yeah. It's like, we got to learn this trick. Now let's go back and poke our noses and stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Then that's the one with the orbital nuclear weapon.
Yeah, right.
This is the plot of season 2 of Picard, by the way. Everything we're discussing right now.
I know I haven't seen it. I'm only up to episode 2, but I already know that's coming. So yeah,
I'm just the time travel stuff is all like, that's what they're in the middle of. Plus Borg. So
plus Borg.
Well, and then you get into the whole alternative universe.
Well,
there's a ton of intervention going on there.
There's a ton of intervention across the multiverse, I think.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think that's right. I think it goes both directions. But in our direction, we have the, in the Federation direction, you have the Prime Directive. Should we be in, should Kirk have told Spock, hey, you need to try and fix this system? Yeah,
or FYI,
of course,
in the future, you're going to be grabbed by angry
pre-warp culture.
Yeah,
they're not a pre-warp culture.
Is this an over-intellectualized conversation for us?
No, this is precisely the correct intellectual level. The mirror universe, I guess they violated the Prime Directive as a matter of course, right? Like, I feel like Deep Space Nine, I remember mirror universe episodes where they went out of their way to violate the Prime Directive.
Yeah, pre-warp. Yeah, once again, but that's not consistent.
I wonder when that pre-warp stuff was. I think that's a later edition.
I think so too. Yeah. I think it's like the developing cultures. I think they're trying to keep this Prime Directive idea alive on life support, and they keep putting patches on it. I don't know if you can. I mean, maybe that's what we're figuring out here, is that this thing just doesn't work except as a plot device when you need it.
Yeah, as a convention. Yeah.
Well, and then and I guess that's where we come back to with all of this stuff, is everything is a plot device. It's not, right? Like, everything in the Star Trek universe exists when a writer needs it, and ceases to exist the moment it becomes too complicated to fit into a story. And the good stories figure out a way to get around it, and the bad ones, lampshade the fact that they're violating it.
Right, and that goes back to what John was saying about how after a while, Roddenberry didn't want any dissent at all, even among the crew of their own ships.
Right, which is not great. Not something that I want out of my TV series, right?
Yeah, it's documentary material.
Right. I mean, this is part of the conversation we had last week was, as much as I want to see stories about the students at the Xavier Institute for Higher Learning taking trigonometry, that is not something that they have the space to fit on the page when they are telling stories, because they have a limited amount of space to fit into that story. So like the kind of deliberations about the precise wording in, Federation study committees over what the precise wording of the Prime Directive should look like, that's something that we're not really going to be privy to, because it's kind of boring, and that's not the point of telling Star Trek stories.
It's the same reason why we don't have a series about the Academy
yet.
You got some potential for conflict, but they do talk about Kirk and Finnegan, but that's about it.
I think we're getting one. Didn't Paramount Plus just announce that they're working on something like that?
I thought so. They always there was the talk of the movies. It keeps coming up, but it never quite happens.
We talk a little bit about it. You've got the Kobayashi Maru.
Right.
Which has been done to death. Thank you. Oh my God. Aren't there other tests in Starfleet Academy?
Yeah, but those are the boring ones. The open book ones. Nobody cares about Nobody cares about the fucking open book astrometrics test. Okay. They just want to see how bad you are at dealing with your crew getting blown up.
Well, the Kobayashi Maru, the ideal way to do the Kobayashi Maru would be for your unwinnable situation to involve the Prime Directive.
Right. That is actually another great one that they should
violate
incorporate.
Or you not violate.
Yeah.
Right. Your crew's going to die if you don't violate it. That might be a great way to
wash out your officer material. Because are they going to stick to the ethic, or are they not going to?
Or are they just going to reprogram the simulation?
By that standard, Kirk definitely fails.
Right.
Because he's violated that traditional norm.
You say he fails. I want cheaters.
Well, yeah, of course you do. I'm just saying by the standard of, do
Right.
you uphold the Prime Directive as your inviolable general order number one?
Of course, isn't cheating, to go off a little bit, an implied repudiation of utopia? Why do you want to cheat utopia?
Right. If your society's perfect, there's no incentive to cheat. That's the same justification the Soviet Union had for putting dissenters in mental institutions. This is a perfect socialist society. How could you dissent? You must be mentally ill.
So we're comparing
shit.
Kirk and I'm not going to go there.
Stalin. Yeah, Stalin. Don't
you
worry
went
about it.
there. I wasn't going to mention it.
No,
Just
it's
imply.
fine. It's fine.
This is getting worse. Now we're comparing Kirk and Stalin. Before I was just depressed about whether it's developing.
I don't really make that. I'm not making a comparison.
Too late. It's been done. It's on the
Right.
record. It's airing in 2 weeks.
I'm not concerned. But, it becomes the idea that, this is plot armor, that the Prime Directive is plot armor. We use it when we want to use it to create a moral or ethical dilemma, and we violate it when we want to ramp up the action. And either way, the decisions the characters make is protected by the use of the Prime Directive.
Well, I suppose as a strange plot device, that has been helpful.
Oh, sure. I mean, like I said, there's this constant tension between, do we follow the Prime Directive, or is this an instance where Kirk needs to grab a disruptor pistol and single-handedly change the institutions on a planet that have been around for hundreds of years?
That's right, man. The strong man philosophy there. Back to Stalin.
Now who's getting back to Stalin?
This is all 100% John's fault.
Well, this has been a blast. It probably seems like now that we've on two occasions now compared Kirk to Stalin, and I think if we mention Stalin 3 times, he might show up, unless that's what's happening in the world right now.
No. Khrushchev will come in and tell us that everything's okay, though.
All right. Well, before we start banging shoes on the table, I should say then, I think it's a good place to wrap. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity. If you can think of any other reason for me to show up, I'd be happy to participate again. This was great.
Oh, we'll come up with some.
We will find a way. Don't worry.
Definitely. But we won't interfere with your culture while we're doing it.
No, not as long as you're not pre-war. As long as you're pre-war, it's fine.
Thanks as always for listening, and our theme music is by Christopher Fiat.